All right. Welcome to chapter 5. We're going to be talking about tissues today. The things I want you to learn here from this chapter, similarly to chapter 3, are going to be the things on the red slides that give nice breakdowns, as well as the highlighted material. Um, Tissues are going to follow a kind of structural rule that you'll see soon, similar to the cell, where inside the cell membrane, but outside the nucleus, we have that cytoplasm that's going to be made up of physical things like the organelles and then fluid like the cytosol. When we talk about tissues, there is this general concept, okay, of a matrix, and a matrix will have fluid and then component parts inside. And sometimes those are named different things based on the tissues. So as we go through this chapter, I want you to kind of have that concept in your head that there's the background fluid or space, then there's the cell and stuff inside of it, and together that creates the tissue. Now, tissues aren't anything too special. They're just specialized cells that, depending on how they're arranged, create specific functions. There's globally going to be four types of tissues that we're going to be looking at. Okay. So, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Epithelial, I want you to always associate with skin. Now, skin isn't always the outside skin in our body, it's also our glands. It's also the ducts, so the tubes that carry the secretions from the glands. It's our arteries, it's our veins. These are all skin type tissues, okay? So we call them epithelial. They form the protective layer of the outside of our body and our body parts, and they function in secretion and absorption. So epithelial tissue can be the external skin, it can be the glands in our body, it can also be the inner lining of the intestines, which absorb nutrients. Anything that has a skin-like substance is going to be epithelial. Connective tissue. This is the stuff between stuff. All connective tissue is going to play a role in supporting and binding things together. It's the space between organs is composed of connective tissue, right? The space between cells, connective tissue. It's the stuff and the glue that holds us together. Muscle tissue. It's any tissue that produces movement, and it is composed of our muscles. The nervous tissue is going to be the tissue that coordinates activities in the body. So it uses electrical impulses to control and coordinate bodily activities, including the signal that triggers movement, but also glandular secretions. So here we are. We have our first table. Memorize this information, get a good understanding of it. With the location, I'm more interested in you being able to recognize examples, right? Recognize examples of muscle, examples of nervous tissue, anything in the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, examples of connective, examples of epithelial. Yeah. So when we talk about tissues, we're talking about three-dimensional structures. So a micrograph is a photo of a very thin section of tissue and specimens. During our quiz that we took last class, I asked what kind of view or section do you get when you cut a bone diagonally, and the answer was oblique. When we're talking about tissues, unlike the body planes, which is transverse, coronal, and sagittal, when we're talking about tissues, we have three different terms: cross section, oblique section, and longitudinal section. Now, they're very simple. If we take a tissue here, this is our tissue, if we cross cut it along the short end, along the width, we get a cross section. If we cut it along a diagonal, we get an oblique section. And if we cut it long ways along the length, we get a longitudinal section. That's all we need to know. Cross goes across the width. Oblique is diagonal. Longitudinal goes down the length. So if I'm looking at a section of epithelial tissue and I'm crossing the width of the skin, I'm looking at a cross section of the skin. If I go along the length of the skin, Then I'm looking at a longitudinal section and saying so on and so forth for oblique. So let's start with epithelium. So this is our skin tissue. I didn't skip anything. Nope. So it's widespread throughout the body. Remember, the integumentary system is the largest body system, and it is composed entirely of our skin, so our epithelial tissue. It covers our organs, our body surfaces. It lines our cavities, our hollow organs. It makes up glands. Remember when we talked about those membranes, the pericardial membrane, the pleural membrane, and the peritoneal membranes that are the protective sacs that our organs are in? That's also epithelial tissue. The thing I want you to remember here, epithelial means skin. Every epithelial tissue has a surface that is called the free or apical surface. It's the part that is exposed to the outside portion. So for our skin, the apical surface is the part we can see. For an organ, the apical surface is the part that is the lining on the outside of the organ. For a duct, it is the part that is inside the duct through which the fluid travels. Yeah? So the free or apical surface is the part that's exposed to the external environment. And every epithelial tissue is anchored to connective tissue underneath, because remember, connective tissue connects other things to things, by a basement membrane. Okay? Epithelial tissue is generally tightly packed, and it contains very little intercellular material because they're packed right on top of each other. There's not a lot of space between stuff. Epithelial tissue readily divides. We are always replacing skin cells, so it divides rapidly. It is generally lacking in blood vessels, especially when we're talking about our surface skin, but is nourished by the cells in the underlying connective tissue. Before we move on, so imagine we have the connective tissue at our bottom layer. Connecting to that is our basal membrane, and then we have the epithelium up here. Nourishments from the connective tissue penetrate the basement membrane and then up into the epithelial tissue. Epithelial cells come in three forms: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. It's called squamous if it's thin or flattened. Think of a flat piece of square paper. It's cuboidal if it's three-dimensional cubed. And it's columnar if it's long and tall, so it's a column. So we have a square that's flat and thin, a cube that's three-dimensional, and a column: squamous, cuboidal, columnar. There's also a name for the layers. If a layer of skin tissue or epithelial tissue has just one layer of cells, we call it simple. Anything after that is stratified because there's multiple stratas. A free surface can be modified to reflect specific function. So often, epithelial tissue will have this thing called cilia. We talked about that last class. That's the little hairs that push things along. Or microvilli, which is just really tiny cilia. Microvilli help with absorption, cilia help pushing things along. So you can imagine that the inner lining of our intestines, which absorb nutrients, have microvilli. But the lining of our throat, or rather our trachea, will have cilia because it'll stop dust and things from getting into our lungs. Yeah. So what do I want you to know about epithelial tissue? Remember, it has a free apical surface, attaches to a basement membrane, gets its nourishments from the connective tissue. It has three forms: squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and depending on the number of layers, it's either simple or stratified. The epithelial tissue will often come with cilia, which are tiny hairs that move things along, keep things out, push things in, or microvilli, tiny cilia that absorb. Simple squamous epithelium. Let's break it down. Simple means one layer. Squamous means flat, square-like cells. What kind of tissue? Skin tissue, epithelium. So let's define it. Well, it's made up of a single layer of thin, flattened cells. Yeah, it's in the title, simple squamous. The cells are tightly packed together. Most epithelium is tightly packed together. It has what we call a broad nucleus. I don't need you to know that, but just know because the cell's flattened, the nucleus is really wide looking because it's not very three-dimensional, it's very two-dimensional because it's flat. Due to the flattened structure, this type of tissue loves diffusion. Things naturally filter in and out of skin. Yeah, whether passive or actively, this is a very diffusion and filtration heavy tissue. And it makes sense, right? Because it's epithelium, it lines organs, organs diffuse things, so does the intestines, right? Because it's built for diffusion, it functions to exchange gases, such as the alveoli and the lungs, or lines the blood and lymph vessels in cavities like the arteries, the veins, and the lymph system. It's delicate because it's so thin and only one layer, and so it can be easily damaged, which is a good thing that skin readily reproduces and divides because it's always being damaged, so we always have to repair it. So don't worry about memorizing all these facts. Tell the story. Simple, one layer. Squamous, flat, thin. Epithelium, skin. Okay, well, if it's one layer, it's flat and thin, and we know skin is stretchy, it's probably delicate, can be easily damaged, which means it has to divide rapidly in order to heal itself. Because it's so thin, things can diffuse and filter through it readily. That means it's really good for things like, the lungs, absorbing gases like air and excreting carbon dioxide in the alveolar sacs, and lining the blood. The arteries, the veins, the capillaries are made of simple squamous epithelium, and blood and lymph travel through them. Yeah. This is what it looks like. Here's our connective tissue. Here, that thin purple line is our basement membrane, and here is our simple squamous epithelium. Just one layer, very thin. And because it's all flat, look at how wide those nuclei are. They're big, bulbous, flat nuclei. This is the lining of a lung. Here's all the connective tissue down there. That thin purple line is the basement membrane, and that teeny tiny cell layer is the lining of the lungs. The lungs are very sensitive. They only have a thin cell layer in thickness, yeah? Simple cuboidal. Let's break it down. Simple, one layer, cuboidal. Looks like a big block, a cube. Epithelium, skin. What do I want you to know here? Well, let's define it. Single layer of cube-shaped cells. And know that the nuclei is centrally located. Again, I'm not too worried about you knowing that, but imagine if it's three-dimensional and it's not being crushed, the nucleus is just in the center. What do I want you to know? It lines a lot of tubes and some glands. So if there's a tube in your body, it's probably cuboidal. It functions in the formation of urine in the kidneys and glandular secretion. So some of the glands are going to be simple cuboidal. When it lines tubes and ducts, there's a special rule here. The free surface is called a lumen or a hollow channel. So remember, with epithelial tissue, the surface that touches the outside environment is called the free or apical surface. But when it's cuboidal, because it creates a tunnel, we call it a lumen. So here's our connective tissue, here's our basal membrane, and here is our single layer of cuboidal cells. Look at those nuclei, nice and central. They make things like ducts and some organ lining. So this is the lining of the kidney. So again, the skin is forming the duct of the ureter as it exits down the kidney and empties into the bladder. So here is your simple simple cuboidal epithelium. That thin purple layer on the outside is going to be your basement layer, and then this mess over here is the connective tissue. Inside is your apical surface because it's forming a duct or a tube, and we call that the lumen now. Simple columnar. Simple, one layer, columnar. It looks like a column, epithelium, skin. One row of tall, elongated cell. The nuclei here are located near the basement membrane. Because the cell is so tall, the nuclei just sits at the bottom. So that we know just from the definition, simple columnar epithelium. So what do I want you to know? They are either ciliated or non-ciliated. Remember, epithelial tissue can have cilia and microvilli. Cilia is the little hairs that push things along. So if it's ciliated, it means it's pushing things along. If it's microvilliated, it means it's absorbing things. There are also versions of simple columnar that are not ciliated. This is going to be things that you think of that don't absorb, but rather maybe secrete. So the uterus, okay, it has secretions. The stomach secretes acid. The intestines, I'm sorry, they are non-ciliated, but they are microvilliated. So they have microvilli that will absorb. So I want you to think with simple columnar, they're either ciliated or non-ciliated. If they're ciliated, we'll get to that later. If they're non-ciliated, it's because they secrete fluids or they absorb nutrients. Okay, remember, ciliated is about moving things. Microvilli is about absorbing or secreting even. So cilia, remember, are long extensions of the free surface. They beat in a different direction. I described it as like when the wave is being done at a baseball game, right? They beat in a different direction or in the same direction together to move cells or mucus in a direction. A ciliated cell might be found in the uterine tubes, the fallopian tubes, right? Because they beat the egg down away from the uterus and away from the ovary and towards the uterus. Some of the cells, on the other hand, might contain microvilli, which is similar to cilia and increase the area of absorption. I know it gets confusing here. Non-ciliated secrete and absorb nutrients. Ciliated can also have microvilli. I don't want you to worry about predicting if a tissue has one or the other. I just want you to know that if I tell you it has cilia, it moves cells and mucus in a direction by beating and pushing things. And if it has microvilli, it's used for absorption. Now, goblet cells are a special type of cells that are types of secretion cells. They secrete mucus into the free surface of the tissue for lubrication. Right? So whether that is the mucus in our nasal cavities, our saliva, right? Our throat to swallow things, whether it's in the parts of our body that need natural lubrication, goblet cells are secreting mucus. So if it has mucus, it has goblet cells. If it has microvilli, it absorbs. If it has cilia, it's ciliated and it moves things. These are all the components of simple columnar. So what does it look like? Connective tissue down here, basement membrane, the thin purple line, and then one layer of column-like cells. The nuclei are based at the bottom. And here is an example of goblet cells embedded in the tissue. Here are also the example of the microvilli. So these are the large intestines, and we can see that here is the connective tissue. Here is that thin basement membrane. Here is the simple columnar cells with microvilli facing the apical or free surface. And these red cells are our goblet cells that secrete mucus. So this secretes mucus so that feces and food can move down the intestines. And then these guys, this is the small intestines. And then these guys are microvilli, which is absorbing nutrients from the food as it passes by. Yeah, so it absorbs the food as it pushes through, passing by, and then these goblet cells secrete mucus to help lubricate that food passing by. Now, we said there is simple and striated. Striated is multiple layers, simple is one layer of cell. Well, there is one exception here to that rule. We call it pseudostriated. All you need to know is pseudostriated is simple, but it doesn't look simple. It's one layer, but it looks like there's multiple layers, so it creates an illusion. These are cells that appear layered due to varying positions of their nuclei within the row of the cells, but they're truly not layered. They're simple. The cells vary in shape. This is our example. That's one layer of cell, but they vary in shape, so it kind of looks like there's a lot of them, but it's not. There's one at a time. And because they're columnar, again, they're a column, and because it's epithelium, it's a skin. All cells touch the basement membrane because that's where they're anchored. They're all anchored to this basement membrane. But as we can see here, as we can see here and here, they don't all make it up to the apical surface. Some of them stop short. In this example, we see cilia. So we know, look at this is the bronchi of the lungs. We know this cilia is used to push things out. Okay, it's either pushing mucus or debris or cells out of the lungs. Of course, we also have our goblet cells here, embedded in each, yeah. It secretes the mucus to line the inside of those lungs, yeah. Most pseudostratified, I want you to associate with cilia. Our ciliated tissues are going to be our pseudostratified columnar. They'll also have goblet cells scattered. So simple columnar will generally have microvilli and goblets. Pseudostratified will generally have cilia and goblets. They're found in passageways, most often in the respiratory system. It uses the mucus to trap infectious microorganisms, and it also sweeps away the dust. The mucus also captures the dust, and then the cilia sweeps away the mucus, which contains the infectious disease organisms and the dust. Again, it's what it looks like. Stratified squamous. Okay, stratified, multiple layers. Squamous, still those thin cells. Epithelium, we're talking about skin. So what's the definition? Many layers of flattened cells. Okay, because it's many layers, it protects underlying stuff. It's named because of the shape of the outermost cell. So what we're going to see is with any stratified tissue, the base cells are actually all cuboidal. All of them are cuboidal, but the outermost layer will be what it's named for. So if I say stratified squamous epithelium, that means the bottom layers are all cuboidal, but the very top layer is squamous. So cuboidal cells in the deeper layers divide, and they push up to the outer layer, at which point they are crushed by the cells and become flattened, getting the squamous appearance. The best example in the body for stratified squamous is our skin. It's our dermis, specifically the epidermis, the outer layer of the skin. That's the part that we see. It lines our mouth, our body, the esophagus, the vagina, the anal canal. And in the external layer, the skin that we see on our outside, the outer layer, I mentioned this in a previous lecture, is keratinized. Keratin is put in, and what that does is it kills the cell, and it turns it into a dry, waterproof, protective layer. So in our stratified squamous epithelium, that is our outer skin, the majority of the integumentary system, it's keratinized on the outside. That's why our skin is dry. Now, we might moisturize it, but that moisturizer doesn't penetrate. It just sits on top of our skin so it feels moisturized. That skin is dead. It creates a waterproof barrier so infectious disease can't just diffuse through it. Underneath it are nice, squishy, non-keratinized cuboidal cell layers. Yeah. Now, keratinization doesn't occur everywhere, okay? Most of the parts of our body that have the epithelium on the inside are non-keratinized, and they remain moist. Our mouth, our esophagus, the vagina, the anal canal, those are all moist tissues. And it's because things move through it, whether it's food, whether it's feces, whether it's the penis for reproduction. That is all a part of the lubrication. So what does it look like? Again, connective tissue on the bottom. We have that basement membrane. The first layer is always anchored to it. We have many layers of cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, but because at the very top layer they get crushed and become squamous, we call it stratified squamous. This is the layer of your skin. Connective tissue, basement membrane, specifically this is the esophagus, and then this is the layer of the skin. Because we know this is the esophagus, we know this is not keratinized. These cells are alive, they're not dead. Stratified cuboidal, multiple layers. Cuboidal, remember we name it for the outermost layer, which means the outermost layer will also be cuboidal. and epithelium skin. 2 to 3 layers of cuboidal cells. Like simple cuboids, they're going to form ducts and glands. So we call their apical surface the lumen. Okay, it's just stronger ducts and glands than that which is created by the simple cuboidal epithelium. Same rules though, it lines the ducts, the sweat glands, salivary glands, ovarian follicles. Okay, when you see cuboidal, you think ducts and glands. That's what I want you to know. And know that the stratified version creates more durable ducts and glands, and the free apical surface forms the lumen. Again, basement membrane, or I'm sorry, connective tissue, basement membrane attaches, and then it's just all cuboidal. So in this example, we're looking at a salivary gland, a sublingual, because it's under the tongue, salivary gland. So in this lumen is going to be saliva, and this is your connective tissue, this is your basement membrane, and this is your stratified cuboidal. Now, because we're taking a look through the width of the structure, we would call this a cross-section microgram or histological view, because we're looking at the histology or the skin, or the tissue, I'm sorry. Stratified columnar, again, tells us the name, many layers columnar skin. Has columnar cells on the surface, cuboidal cells still in the base. This is a rare tissue type. Memorize this exactly. It's the male urethra. The male urethra is stratified columnar. There are some very large gland ducts that are also this way. All I want you to know, multiple layer columnar skin, the male urethra, maybe some large ducts. So this is one such duct, the urethra. So we have our connective tissue. Yeah, we have our basement membrane. And then we have our layer of the cuboidal cells turning into finally the columnar cells, so it is stratified columnar. You will see here there are no microvilli or cilia because it doesn't need lubrication, it doesn't need anything to push. We'll learn later that smooth muscle pushes through here, but for now, understand the urine moves through this into urethra until it is expelled from the head of the penis or out of the urethral opening for biosex females. One more special thing, transitional epithelium. Transitional, all you need to know is it needs to expand. This is a type of skin tissue designed to distend and stretch. It returns to its normal size. So think in the body, what are things that expand and then return to the normal size? The urinary bladder gets filled with urine. It expands when you pee it out. It shrinks. The urethra expands as the urine is passing through it, shrinks afterwards. The ureters. Ureters are the tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder. So the ureters expand as the urine leaves the kidney and empties into the bladder via the ureter. So these tissues contract. So the contraction of these tissues pushes it into its irregular stretched out shape in order to empty. And so when they distend, they become elongated and then they contract to empty. So it functions as an expandable lining. It prevents the urine from rupturing through as the tissue spreads. So transitional epithelium, just a special type of skin that's stretchy. Okay, we can see it's generally pseudostratified underneath and then cuboidal on the top, although sometimes it's also just really weird squamous. I don't care that you know what it looks like. What I care is that you know how it functions. Again, this is the kidney, this is the bladder, these are the ureters emptying. The bladder and the ureters are made of transitional epithelium because it needs to expand and contract without rupturing so that urine doesn't just explode into our inner cavities, into the abdominal or pelvic cavity. Here it is. Memorize it. I'm not so worried about the function location specifics as long as you can define what these terms means and give some maybe examples of where you might find it and how it might work, okay? Remember, cuboidal is always going to be glandular. Columnar is going to be secretion or absorption. Okay. Pseudostratified means single layer but appears like multiple. Epithelium is going to, or transitional epithelium is going to be stretchy. Okay, that was the tissue itself. Let's talk about glands. So glands are a type of epithelial tissue. They're a specific type that are made up of cuboidal or sometimes columnar, and they're going to secrete stuff, okay? So remember, columnar will generally make up the gland. Cuboidal could be the gland, it could be the duct. Glands are more often columnar. There are some cuboidal glands. Ducts are almost always cuboidal. So again, they produce and secrete substances. If they secrete substances that leave the body, we call them exocrine. Remember exocytosis? Exo means leave. Crine means secrete. So secretions that leave the body are exocrine gland. Secretions that are used in the body, like fluids and blood, is endocrine. Remember endocytosis, pulling it into the cell. Secretions inside are endocrine. So the thyroid, the pancreas, these are endocrine glands and a part of the endocrine system. Yeah. The exocrine glands are also, oddly enough, a part of the endocrine system, but they do secrete out of the body. Good example here, sweat glands. Sweat glands secrete are exocrine glands that secrete waste product and water out of the body. So again, exocrine glands are classified by the ways that the gland secretes. So what do I want you to know? Merocrine or Eserine glands. They're the most common type. They produce, release fluids by exocytosis. They kick it out of the cell and out of the body. What do I want you to know here? I want you to know that some of them are serous glands. Serous glands produce serous fluid. A serous membrane that we'll get to later, those are the membranes that protect the organs. So those membranes that the organs sit in, those sacs, are filled with a serous fluid. Its serous fluid is secreted by Myrisine glands or Eserine glands, yeah? They also produce mucus, yeah? So pancreas, salivary glands, sweat glands, these are Merocrine glands. What I want you to know is merocrine is serous or mucus. Apocrine glands are a kind of gland that pinches off a part of their cell during secretion. These are going to be mammary glands. So in breast tissue, you have mammary glands, okay? They produce milk for breastfeeding. An apocrine gland is a gland where the cell fills with milk and then it breaks off a part of that cell containing the milk so that the milk can leave via the duct and be ingested by the infant, the newborn. Holocrine glands release an entire cell that then disintegrates into the secretion. I want you to think oil glands, sebaceous glands. This is the stuff that gets the oil into your skin. It's weird, but what I want you to know with exocrine glands that leave the body, merocrine, right, is going to be serous fluid or mucus. Your runny nose, yeah? That's an exocrine gland. Apocrine is going to be a part of the cell releases. That's going to be mammary glands, yeah? Holocrine glands, they become hollow. They discharge the entire the entire cell, right? Holocrine discharges the entire cell, making it hollow. Apocrine, a part of the cell gets discharged. Merocrine, mucus, I guess, go that route. Merocrine glands, right? They produce the mucus, they exocyte it and push it out. This is an apocrine gland, yeah? This is the part that contains the milk, breaks it off, goes out, and then holocrine. This cell divides, pinches off, gets digested, and goes out. So again, merocrine, mucus, apocrine, a part of, think milk in the mammary glands. Holocrine is going to be the whole cell becoming hollow, think hair cells, sebaceous oil glands. There it is. Know it. Connective tissue, it connects stuff to stuff. That's what I want you to know. Bind, support, protect, serve as the framework, fill in space, whatever. It connects stuff. Unlike epithelial, it's not tightly packed. It lies far away from each other because it connects things. This is where we get that similarity to the cytoplasm being the organelles and the cytosol. All connective tissue is existing in what we call an extracellular matrix. So it's outside of the main bulk of cells connecting everything together. And we call that the extracellular matrix. Or the not intercellular, meaning between cells, material. That is similar to your cytoplasm. And inside you have the physical stuff, the fibers, and the fluid, the ground substance. This would be equatable to your organelles and your cytosol. So in between organs, we have the connective tissue, the extracellular matrix. In it, we have fibers and fluid called ground substance. There's different consistencies, and that tells us what kind of connective tissue you have. Connective tissue can divide, and it may have a blood supply. Epithelial tissue always has a lot of blood. This might have a decent blood supply, but not always. So again, here's a cell. Remember that phospholipid bilayer. We have membrane proteins. This is our transmembranous protein. This is our peripheral protein. We have our cytoskeleton. This is our actin filament, right? The microfilament that makes a nice rigid cytoskeleton. It composes the protein actin. It also is a part of myofilaments making up muscle. Here's another cell. We have a peripheral protein. We have some glycoproteins over here, right? That acts as a cell identifier for the immune system. These are all cells. In between the cell, or in the extracellular space, we have the extracellular matrix. It's composed of the fluid, that's the blue part here, the ground substance, and it's composed of fibers. That makes up the extracellular matrix. All together, this is your connective tissue tying this cell to that cell. All right. There are two categories of connective tissue. Fixed, which means it stays there, and wandering, which means it moves. Not rocket science. We have three types of connective tissue cells. So remember, extracellular matrix is composed of the ground substance, the water, and the cells that we call fibers. So there are fibroblasts. Fiber meaning a fiber or a spindle. O is our contracture that just combines these two terms. Blast meaning creates. A fibroblast builds or creates fibers. It's the most common. It is all the fibers that actually create the connective tissue of the connective tissue. It's a large star-shaped cell, and it secretes fibers. I don't care that you know it's star-shaped, just know it builds fibers. This is fixed. It stays in place. It holds things in place, in fact. Macrophage, or histocytes. These are cells in your histology, in your tissue. These perform phagocytosis, or cell eating. These defend you against foreign particles, so they wander. They travel around and they eat the garbage and the bad stuff in your body. So, fibroblast build fibers. Macrophage, eating cells. They eat garbage. They eat infection. This is fixed. This is wandering. This is a mast cell. This is also fixed. All you want to know about this is they're located near blood vessels. I want you to know heparin and histamine. Heparin is anticoagulation. This has to do with how thick the blood is. Histamine promotes inflammation. This is your allergy response. Okay? So, connective tissue is fixed or wandering. An example of fixed is fibroblast that builds fibers, mast cells that secrete heparin or histamine. Heparin is anticoagulating, so anti-clotting. Histamine promotes inflammation and allergy responses. They're located near blood vessels. It's also fixed. Wandering type is macrophages or histocytes. They eat garbage and infection. These are all examples of the types of fibers that exist in the extracellular matrix that is composed of fibers and ground substance. That's a fibroblast. I don't care that you know what it looks like, but look how weird it is. It's making little fibers here. This is a macrophage. It is eating a bacterium. You can see it's wrapping around and engulfing. It will eventually fully ingest and digest that bacterium. What will it use to digest it? Well, lysosome. The organelle lysosome will go in and digest it. And while digesting it, it'll create the chemical waste peroxide, which then peroxisome cells will go and absorb the peroxide so that the peroxide doesn't cause genetic mutation here, resulting in poor cell division, creating cancer. This is a mast cell. Again, I don't care that you know what it looks like, but it secretes either heparin to create anticoagulation and stop blood clots, or histamine to promote inflammation for an allergic reaction. It's located near blood vessels. All right, fibroblasts. I know it's part on part on part. Yes, fibroblast gets broken into 3 types. We have collagen or white fibers, elastic or yellow fibers, and then reticular fibers. Collagen is your thick fibers, okay? Collagen, very densely packed. It is very strong, a lot of tensile strength. What I want you to know, collagen is the part that appears white. What's an example? Tendons and ligaments. Tendons connect bones to muscle. Ligaments connect bones to bones. Muscle and bone pull on each other very aggressively. It needs strong, thick fibers, collagen fibers. Yeah, collagen is the white fiber. It's our tendons and ligaments. They are not very elastic. So the opposite of that is the elastic fibers. They're made up of the protein elastin and are incredibly branched and networked so that they're stretchy and flexible. I want you to think of any connective tissue that has to move a lot, like your vocal folds. Okay, your vocal cords are always making weird shapes so that you can make sound, yeah? So it's elastic, generally appears yellow. Collagen fibers, the protein is collagen. It's made just up of collagen. Reticular fibers, I don't really care that you know a lot about this. It's also branching and networking. What I want you to think of is when you see reticular, think of the spleen and the liver, okay? It's related to the spleen and the liver and how it's held together. So again, collagen, big bulky ones. They're a type of connective tissue fiber that is produced by fibroblasts for ligaments and tendons. Elastic, they're going to be stretchy. Reticular, spleen, and liver. This is not a red slide, but there it is. Your components, yeah, your cellular components of the extracellular matrix is going to be the fibroblasts, macrophages, mast cells. You're also going to have your fiber components, right? That's going to be collagen, elastic, reticular, and then finally you have your fluid, your ground substance, okay? So connective tissue has cells. It also has extracellular matrix, which are fibers and ground substance. All right, how is it organized? Yeah, it can either be loosely connective tissue or densely connective tissue. And then we have 3 special connective tissues, cartilage, bone, and blood. Okay, what I really want you to know here is connective tissue can be densely packed or loosely packed. And then just know that we call cartilage, bone, and blood a type of connective tissue. That's what the type of tissue it is. It's not epithelial, it's not skin, right? It's connective tissue. And it's not nervous tissue. Blood, bone, cartilage, it wouldn't make sense to be nervous tissue. That's not nerve base. Loose connective tissue. There's going to be 3 types here. We have areolar connective tissue. What do I want you to know about this? Oh, the main cell type is fibroblast. The main cell type is always fibroblast. Fibers hold things together, okay? Yes, it's made up of fibroblasts, so it's made up of collagen and reticular fibers. So I want you to know areolar is going to be between skin and muscles. It holds the different parts of the skin together. It holds different muscles into muscle groups. So if I say areolar connective tissue, you think skin and muscles. There's also adipose or fat tissue. Yeah, adipose means fat, so an adipocyte is a fat cell. Yeah, it stores fat in its cytoplasm. So anywhere where there needs to be heat and cushion, insulation, that's where it's going to be. Between our muscles is going to have some fat. The big one is right under our skin. Our subdermis or subcutaneous fat is the part that keeps our body warm. It insulates us. Finally, reticular. What did I say about reticular? Spleen and liver. Don't worry about it. It's spleen and liver. Reticular connective tissue is a form of loose connective tissue, and it has to do with spleen and liver. Areolar, again, I don't care that you know what it looks like, but know that it holds the different muscles into muscle groups, right? It might have some elastic fibers, it might have some collagen, it might have some reticular, it all has ground substance. Just areolar holds the skin, parts of the skin and the various muscles together. Adipose, all of that yellow, that gold looking substance, that's fat. So most of the cytoplasm is fat. This is for insulation of heat, right? So we have it around the hair follicles to trap the heat in. It's around our skin. It's in between our muscles to keep everything nice and warm. Dense connective tissue. This contains the most fibroblasts. It must, because it's mostly dense fibers. So it's very, very dense. Because it's dense, what I want you to know about dense connective tissue is that it heals slowly because there's very little blood supply. Because there's so much density of the fibers, there's not much room for ligaments or for arteries, veins, and capillaries. So think ligaments, tendons, okay? Again, dense connective tissue. So if I say tendon, you should be thinking of collagen fibers arranged in a dense connective tissue, yeah? So many, many fibroblasts. So the kind of question I could ask here is, a ligament is composed of what type of connective tissue? Dense or loose? Or a ligament is composed of what kind of fibers? Elastic fibers, collagen fibers, reticular fibers. Or ligaments are going to contain many or few fibroblasts. All of those things are the kinds of questions I can ask about dense and loose connective tissue, whether it's adipose, areolar, or reticular, okay? That's what it looks like. Very, very dense, very, very thick, very layered. Here's an example. It's making up what we could call either the patellar tendon or the quadriceps tendon. Yeah, sometimes we call it the quadriceps tendon. Sometimes we call it the supra and infrapatellar tendon. We also have the medial collateral ligament here. So again, ligaments and tendons. Okay, on to our special type of connective tissue, cartilage. What I want you to know right here. So cartilage provides some cushioning at the end of bone, okay? Cartilage is at the end of bone. It's also in flexible things sometimes. So cartilage is made up of cartilage cells. Chondro is our cartilage word. So a chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. Now, a chondrocyte resides within a little empty space or chamber called a lacunae. Yeah? On the outermost portion of the cartilage is a connective tissue called the pericardium. So all you know is cartilage cells make up the majority of the cartilage, and each cell is in a little chamber called the lacunae. And then the outer part, that is where the cartilage grows, is called pericardium, the side or outer portion of the cartilage. There are 3 types of cartilage. Note here, cartilage lacks a vascular system. It heals very slowly. So, 3 types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, it makes up most of the cartilage. Bone. Hyaline is bone. If it's the end of a bone, it's hyaline. Remember I talked about bone ossification, becoming solid bone? You're born with a cartilage skeleton. You don't have a bone skeleton until you're about 40. It slowly ossifies. So you have the bone, the cartilage, and the pericardium grows out. Then the hydroxyapatite is deposited, turning the cartilage into bone, and it expands. The pericardium grows out, more hydroxyapatite becomes bone. Pericardium grows out, becomes bone until we lengthen. Eventually, the bone overtakes the cartilage and everything ossifies. Hyaline cartilage, most common type of cartilage because it's on the ends of every bone. It's also in other areas. I want you to know bone. Elastic cartilage. Where is your cartilage flexible? Your ear, your larynx, your nose. Can you move your nose? Yeah, you sure can. Can you fold your ear? Yes, you can. Can your larynx bend? Yep. So it's elastic. So hyaline cartilage will have a lot of fibrocartilage in it. This will be, or I'm sorry, will have a lot of fibers in it. Okay. But fibrocartilage is more tough than that. This is our shock absorber. So this is going to have more elastic fibers. This will have some collagen fibers. This will have the most. Fibrocartilage, I want you to think the discs of the body. Okay? The menisci are also fibrocartilage. It's a shock absorber. It's made to take a beating. And then the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is held together with the pubic bones. There's a disc between the two pubic bones. So discs in the spine and the pelvis, things in the knees that are shock absorber. Fibrocartilage is tough. It takes a beating. It absorbs shock. So hyaline cartilage at the end of bones. It is the cartilage that connects us to the sternum. It wants to be cartilage rather than bone because it doesn't want to be rigid. It wants to expand a little bit. Hyaline cartilage is a little pliable. Some of the hyaline cartilage, like along the ribs, never becomes bone. This allows the ribs to expand and contract when we breathe. Elastic cartilage, again, look at all those elastic fibers, yeah? Now, again, we have the lacuna, right? This is the lacunae. That's our empty space. And inside, we have our chondrocyte. And then we have the connective tissue, okay? That makes up all together the cartilage. And because it's mostly elastic fibers, it's elastic cartilage. So it's making up the ear in this example. Again, we have the red part. That's the chondrocyte in the little circle, the empty pit. That's the lacunae. This is hyaline cartilage. It's a little denser. It's got more collagen in it. And so it's hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage, again, those big lacuna, empty spaces, the tiny chondrocyte. Then look at how much collagen. That is so densely packed. It's very sturdy, very shock absorbent. This is your discs. Next type of connective tissue, bones. So bones are rigid due to the presence of mineral salts. What I want you to know is things like calcium and phosphorus make the bone much firmer than cartilage, gives it its strong supportive structure. Yeah. Collagen in the matrix does provide some flexibility. Bones can move a little bit, but because the mineral salt is there, they can't move nearly as much as cartilage. Bone is simply cartilage that has mineral salt added to it. So we start as cartilage, we deposit mineral salts made of calcium and phosphorus called hydroxyapatite, and it turns the collagen, the cartilage, into a more rigid structure that we now call bone. Bone supports and protects the body, the structures, the cranial and thoracic cavities, yeah. Muscles attached to bone. Inside the bone is an empty tube where the marrow is. We have the red marrow, and not listed here, we have the white marrow. That makes our blood cells red and white respectively. It also stores and releases chemicals such as, again, calcium and phosphorus. Now, there's two types of bone, compact and spongy. What is compact? Really sturdy bone. What is spongy? More flexible bone. There's a lot of definitions in tissues, guys. Okay, there's a lot of subsections of each, but if you can define the word, then you're fine. Loose connective tissue, it's loose. It's not very tightly packed. Dense, it's dense. Compact bone, very thick, strong bone. Spongy bone, bone that's more flexible. Now, bone, the word in Latin we want to know is osti. Osti means bone. O is the contracture. Cyte is the cell. Bone cell, osteocyte. Much like chondrocytes, they are in a little empty chamber called a lacunae. Now, bone is arranged in circles like a tree trunk. If you cut a tree in a cross section, you can count its age by counting its layers of rings. Those rings are called lamellae. and they create a big opening is where the bone marrow goes, that runs through the whole length, the longitudinal length of a bone, and we call that a central or Haversian canal. So looking at bones, this is our little lacunae, it's our empty space. This is our osteocyte. Okay, here we can see little lacunae with an osteocyte forming bone that runs in rings. An individual ring is called a lamella, and it creates an opening in the center through which the bone marrow and the blood vessels travel. That is called the central or Haversian canal. Now, the entire unit of bone is called a Haversian system or an osteon. So going back here, the individual circles are lamella. The osteocyte exists within the lamella lacunae. And then there's a hollow center of the bone called a Haversian canal or a central canal. The central canal with the lamella create units called osteons or Haversian systems. So everything in that circle is an osteon or a Haversian system. Okay? The last thing I want you to know, there are channels that contain blood vessels that distribute the blood throughout the bone called canaliculi. Canaliculi, yeah? Canaliculi. Bone has very good blood supply. It heals rapidly from injury. Takes about 4 weeks to heal a broken bone. Takes over 3 months to heal a sprained ligament or tendon. So again, this is the osteocyte. This is the lacuna. We need to exchange blood. Here are the canaliculi. And you can see the little lines here, the canaliculi. The canaliculi permeating the entire osteon or Haversian system, made up of lacunae with canaliculi, in which we have the osteocyte, forming circular rings called lamella around a big opening called the Haversian canal or central canal. All right, last connective tissue, we got blood. Blood transports stuff. So what I want you to know, it transports gases, it transports waste. Blood will transport oxygen or carbon dioxide as well as other waste. In the blood, we have, similar to, again, the cytoplasm, where we have the organelles and the cytosol, or the extracellular matrix, where we have the fibers and the ground substance. In blood, we have the formed elements and the fluid, the plasma. The formed elements are going to be our red blood cells, which carry oxygen, our white blood cells which fight infection, and our platelets, also known as thrombocytes, which are used in blood clotting. Most cells are produced, most blood cells are produced in the red marrow. Okay, that's within really long bones. The long bones contain red marrow that produces red blood cells and platelets, which make up the vast majority of our blood. There's also white marrow that creates white blood cells, much less prevalent. What I want you to know about blood, it's composed of formed elements, the cells, which are red for oxygen, white for fighting infection, platelets for clotting, and then the sugary fluid called plasma. Blood cell is produced in the marrow, the big central hollow tube of the bone. Most of it is produced in the red bone marrow, which is the red blood cell and platelets. The white blood cells are produced in the white marrow. So here's some blood. So we have a red blood cell. We have 2 different types of white blood cells. We'll learn more about that in a later chapter. And then we have platelets. That yellowy, sugary fluid is the plasma. Altogether, we have blood. The platelets, the white blood cells, the red blood cells are the formed elements, and the fluid is the plasma. Again, here is the white blood cells with that dense nucleus. Here are the red blood cells. Interesting fact to note, red blood cells do not have nuclei. They are called denucleated. And then platelets, which do have nuclei, they're just very, very tiny. All right, there it is. All of the table. There's your areolar tissue, your adipose, your reticular. This is example of your loose connective. Everything else is dense, and it should make sense. Bone, hyaline, elastic fibro, all of that is specialized, and then your dense is your tendons, ligaments. Blood is also specialized. Yeah, so we have our loose, our dense, which is just one line, and then our specialized. Know this slide. All right, membranes. Okay, so a membrane is another type of connective tissue. A membrane is going to come in two forms, epithelial and connective. Epithelial is a skin membrane. There are three types, cutaneous, mucous, serous. And then there is connective membranes known as synovial joints. There's nothing else I want you to know about connective membranes. Connective membranes are synovial membranes. So a connective membrane connects things. When two bones come together to form a joint, those bones where they connect to each other is wrapped in a big connective membrane called a synovial membrane, and it's filled with fluid called a synovial fluid that lubricates the joint so it doesn't grind on each other, creating arthritis. Connective tissue membranes form our joint membranes. They're synovial membranes. Sacs around our joints that are filled with lubricating synovial fluid. For epithelial membranes, we have our serous membranes. Those are the organ membranes. All I want you to know, the example here is pleural, pericardium, and peritoneum. Remember, pleura membrane is the fluid-filled sac that the lung sits in. Remember, the part that touches the organ is called visceral portion, because the viscera means the organ, so the organ portion. The parietal, or the peripheral, is the portion that lines the cavity. So the pleural membrane is a type of serous membrane, which is a type of epithelial membrane. It produces serous fluid between the parietal and visceral portions that create the fluid component that absorbs shock so that the organ doesn't get beat up, the membrane does. Remember, the serous fluid is in between the visceral and parietal portion, which is known as a potential space, because it's where potentially an infection could happen. Pericardium is the membrane around the heart. Peritoneum is the membrane around the organs or viscera of the abdomen, the kidney, the liver, the spleen, yeah, the intestines, pancreas, stomach. So epithelial membranes, serous membranes, they're the membranes that protect organs. They have the parietal and visceral part filled with serous fluid. That's why it's called the serous membrane. Mucous membranes, what do I want you to know? They produce mucus, so therefore they have goblet cells. That's it. All I want you to know, a mucous membrane is a type of membrane that contains goblet cells, makes mucus. Where are you going to find it? You're going to find it in the nasal cavity. You're going to find it in the respiratory system because it's how we keep gunk out of our lungs. It's going to be in the digestive system, mucus moving feces through the system. It's going to be in the urinary areas like the bladder, the kidneys. It's going to be in the reproductive system, right? The vaginal canal lubricates itself for sexual intercourse. So it's going to have mucous membranes lining the inside of the vaginal canal. It's also going to be in our oral canal, right? Our tongue, our mouth all secretes saliva, right? And enzymes that break up food. So it's very wet. It has mucus. Mucous membrane has goblet cells, secretes mucus. The questions I'm going to ask about this is, what are the parts? So a serous membrane has what fluid? Serous. Has two portions. What are they? Parietal and visceral. Where might I find them? The pleura, the pericardium, peritoneum. Mucous membranes have what kind of cells? Goblet. What do they produce? Mucus. Where might I find it? Name a wet spot. Name a wet spot. Cutaneous membrane. It's the skin. The outermost portion of our skin is called the cutaneous membrane. It is dry, it is keratinized, and therefore it is dead and makes it waterproof. So it is stratified squamous epithelium, yeah, keratinized at the outermost portion. That's our cutaneous membrane. Not too crazy. And then again, remember, synovial membrane around joints filled with synovial fluid. What's it filled with? Synovial fluid. What's it surround? Joints. All right, on from membranes to muscle, okay? Muscle. It's muscle. There's nothing really to say more about that. It's made of muscle fibers. Remember, micro filaments are made up of the protein actin, and they compose myofibers. So myo is muscle, muscle cell is a myocyte, muscle fiber is a myofiber, composed of the protein actin because it activates, it moves. There's three types of muscle: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. It is not complicated. If it attaches to the skeleton, it's skeletal muscle and moves you. If it is the heart, it's cardiac muscle. It pumps the heart. If it is any muscle anywhere else, it is smooth. Fun fact, most of your body, a little under half of it, is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, what do I want you to know? It's voluntary. You decide to move it. Your skeletal muscle attaches the skeletons, or moves the skeleton, so it's muscle attached to the skeleton. It is voluntary. I want you to know it's striated, which means there's little stripes on it, okay? Has many nuclei. Just because it needs to coordinate a lot of activity, it must have a lot of brain power, so it needs a lot of nuclei because that's the brain of the cell. It's stimulated by nerves. It moves the head, the trunk, and the limbs. So again, what am I going to ask you about? Which type of muscle tissue is voluntary and appears striated? Skeletal muscle. Which type of muscle tissue attaches to the skeleton? Skeletal muscle. Which type of muscle tissue moves the trunk, the head, the limbs? Skeletal muscle. Which type of muscle tissue receives stimulation from nerve cells to move the body? Skeletal muscle. Yeah, this is what it looks like. Long tubes, many stripes. That's called striated. Many nuclei. This one has 2 nuclei right here. This one's got, like, look at that, 5 nuclei maybe? A lot of nuclei, a lot of brain power. Your skeletal muscles do a lot of dexterous things. Yeah, playing the piano, it's a lot of stuff happening. Smooth muscle. It has no striations. That makes it smooth. It's involuntary. You don't do it. It's things in the internal organs like blood vessels, digestive tract. You don't engage any muscle to actively think, pump my blood. You don't engage any muscles to think, push my food down the intestines, right? That happens through peristalsis. It happens automatically. The signal from the nerve happens regularly at intervals, and it just causes the muscle to contract. Smooth muscle lacks striation. That's why it's smooth. It is involuntary, and it is anywhere else in the body that is not muscle or cardiac. So where might I find smooth muscle? Pick the multiple choice answer that's not the skeleton or the heart. Again, one central nucleus. I don't care that you know that, but it's smooth, no striations. So here we are in the stomach, the small intestines. The stomach pushes it into the small intestines push it through the small intestines into the large intestines, out the colon and out the sphincter, the anal sphincter. That's all smooth. It all happens on its own. Cardiac muscle. Where do you think it is? The heart, yes. It has branching fibers. It looks like this. We've seen this in our notes before. This is the branching fiber of the heart. What I want you to know is it's still involuntary, but it's striated. It has a striped appearance. You don't control your heartbeat. You don't have to think about it, okay? It makes up most of the heart. It pumps the blood into the heart, through the heart into the vessels. What I want you to know is there's a gap junction between the different cells that are called intercalated discs. Why are these important? Here's the cell. They have the little striations. Here's the intercalated disc. The way the heart muscle works is I get an electrical impulse. It comes into this cell. Before this muscle contracts, the intercalated disc launches it to the next one, creating a little bit of a pause so that now there's enough time for the electricity to get through all the cells and they contract together so the whole heart pumps at once. You don't need to explain that to me, but I do want you to know that the heart cardiac muscle is striated, involuntary, and has gaps that connect each other called intercalated discs. Something I might ask as a bonus question is, what is the function of an intercalated disc? And it's to help coordinate the impulse from the nerve so that the heart beats all together at once rather than one cell at a time. Again, here it is. Memorize it. Nervous tissue. We are almost done. So, nervous tissue, it's the nerves, the brain, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves. The cell of a nerve is called a neuron. Okay? It has a body called a soma. That is where the body of the cell is and the nucleus. Then it has dendrites and axon. Dendrites detect, so they receive information. Axons act, so they send information. So when information comes down a neuron, it connects to a dendrite, which receives the information, goes through to the soma, the cell body, which then sends it along the axon, where it will connect to the next neuron at the dendrite. There are little helper cells with nerve cells called neuroglia. These are nerve helpers. They provide nourishment, communication to the cell. They help the cell stay alive. It binds the nervous tissue together. It phagocytizes waste and other nutrients, but it doesn't conduct the nerve signal. It's not the neuron. So here it is. Here's a neuron, and here are the neuroglia. So they're all those little dots. Look at all those little neuroglia. This is the massive neuron. So these help keep this guy alive and connected. This is the body called the soma, the dendrite, which receives information, the axon, which sends information. I'm not going to ask you in a picture to list, so you don't need to know what they look like, because histologically, you can't really tell which is which. This is just an image for fun to make it look like you can. In real histology, I don't know which of these is dendrite and axon. You can't tell. You have to see how it functions. So just know dendrite receives information, soma processes it, axon sends it out, neuroglia takes care of the cell. That's it. Again, a lot of definitions in this. Memorize those special slides, okay? And know the important facts of what the highlighted stuff is. A lot of this, if you really just put some critical thinking into it, the vocabulary itself tells you a lot about what's going on. Remember, physiology informs anatomy. Anatomy demonstrates physiology. What the thing does tells you something about what it looks like. And what it looks like tells you something about how it works. So when you're thinking about how to study for this, think about the Latin and Greek roots, the prefixes and suffixes, and how they define things. And then think how to tell the story. What is actually happening in the tissue? Okay? Awesome. That's it for this one, guys. Have a great one.